Okay, today we're going to be dealing with pivot tables and some of the cool things we can do with pivot tables. Now, one of the things to note is that in some cases you can create a temp table or you can use a common table expression and do some of the cool things that you could normally do with a pivot table. So it's not like it's the only way that you can manipulate data. So it's just another method, and that's one of the reasons why I want to discuss it, because I think it's a really good and useful method to have. So we're going to look at a table just as an example. Let's suppose we had 3 salespeople on our sales team, and those salespeople make outbound calls. And the outbound calls can be certain results, right? The client can hang up on them. There could be success, in other words, an item is sold, or there could be basically no answer. All right, and so let's suppose we have a quota each day that we want the salesperson to at least do 7 calls a day. Now, this example is a pretty small example, and the reason why is just want to show you some of the syntax and everything, plant some ideas. But I have used a pivot table in this situation in which we did call center data, and we were looking at the results, and what we wanted to do is track the count of results. So I have actually used a pivot table in a very similar example to this. And so this is just one of the ways in which it can be applied. Another way I've applied a pivot table is with energy data, and I've even applied it with stock data. But I want to use a kind of a different example because I've been using a lot of stock data examples. So this time I want to use a sales example just to show you how wide the application is. So here's our data. We have 3 salespeople. We have John, we have Jane, and we have Jack. And we have different call results. I think there's only 3, which is no answer, disconnect, or success, which would mean a product is sold. So what we want to do is we want to build a table, and we want to see the count of the total amount of calls that John, Jane, and Jack took, right? Now, right off the bat, we know that if we're trying to count the total amount of calls that John, Jack, and Jane, or John, Jane, and Jack took, that's going to be a count star. That's our function right there. Okay. Now, of course, probably right now some people could think of some other methods. We could do count star where salesperson equals John, for instance, and that would count. There are some other methods of solving this problem, but what we're going to do today is we're going to actually do a method where we solve the problem using a pivot table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the names very first off. So in pivot tables, you would select the categories or basically the column headers that you want. Okay, so I want John, Jane, and Jack. Those are going to be my columns right off the bat. That syntax should make sense. I should say, let's ignore the from for a second. But these are the columns that I'm wanting. I'm going to want a column named John, a column named Jane, and a column named Jack. And then I'm going to want the total, the aggregate, the count of how many calls they took. So those are going to be my columns. So I'm going to be selecting that from, and this is what I would like to think of as the pivot table source. Now, that's not probably the official name of this, but it's always helpful to have a name for what you're doing, in my opinion, because it's kind of like math. People have like various names for like certain equations, like the quadratic equation, and we know what that's referring to. So I like to think of this right here as being the source for the entire pivot table. For instance, John, Jane, and Jack are going to come from the salesperson, right? So salesperson's got to be here. We're going to be tallying the count of all their calls. Well, that's going to come from here. That's going to count star where salesperson equals John, Jane, or Jack. Okay, so that's the next part. So we have a source table. We're selecting our categories. We have our columns. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to select those columns from, and then we're going to have our source. That's what S is. Well, actually, S stands for sales, but it can stand for source. This is kind of an alias right here. Now we're going to pivot. And this is where we're going to do this pivot here. And we are going to apply our function, right? We wanted to count, and what are we going to be counting? We're going to be counting the call result, right? So we're going to be counting this. So it's kind of like, let's go back to select count star from sales calls where name equals John. What are we doing there? What's the logic? We're counting the total calls from the sales calls table where the name equals John. So we're going to do something similar, except we're doing it as a pivot table. We're selecting these columns as the name of the salespeople. This is our source where we're getting it from, that table, the salesperson call result from sales calls. We're then pivoting it on the count of the call results, just like we would do if we did select count star from sales calls where name equals John. And then the next step we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, we're going to count it for the salesperson in our categories. And I'm just going to copy and paste this, or in our columns. So let's review. Okay, because this, if you look at this, it is kind of similar to select count star from sales calls where name equals John, and then you apply that to where name equals Jane, and then where name equals Jack. There's some similarities here. Here's our source. We're selecting our columns, then we're pivoting it. Here's our count function, and we're doing the count function for salesperson in the columns John, Jane, and Jack. Okay, and so we run our query, and you'll see that John took 6 sales calls, Jane took 6 sales calls, and Jack took 9 sales calls. So, this again is a very basic example, though it's funny. Even though it's a basic example, I have seen several companies use pivot tables this way. So it can't be that basic in the sense that it is actually used this way. But this is a basic example that shows you the logic of a pivot table. You're selecting your columns, then you're getting that. Once you select your columns, you're getting it from your source. Notice your source has both the data for this and the data for your columns. That source has to cover everything. You're then pivoting it on your function, and then you're going to say, okay, so this is our function here. We want to get the count, and we want to get the count for the category, obviously salesperson in these 3 categories. So hopefully that shows you kind of the basics of that. You can then extrapolate that. Like I said, I've seen pivot tables used. One of them was used for energy data, where what we were doing was we were pivoting the percent. We would basically, the company would dig up a bunch of minerals, and then they would calculate the percent of minerals in each of those. In each of those, like what was it? They were putting them in barrels, and so then they would calculate the percent of minerals in each of those barrels, like magnesium or whatnot. And there was a pivot table. So the categories were the various minerals that it could be, like magnesium or sodium or whatever they dug up. And then they would pivot, the actual percent for all of those categories. So this is used. I'm trying to, right off the top of my head, it's too late to think of, but right off the top of my head, I can't think of a stock example. But these pivot tables are applied quite frequently, and so it's not as complicated as it looks when you look at it. Actually, once you understand the logic, you'll see, oh, there's the source, and then this is where I'm going to apply that. So that should give everyone an example of how to do that.